right. Well, I might make a bit of a start. My name is Jen McDonnell and I am a Senior Associate at Capire, and I am stepping in today to facilitate this webinar on behalf of Mel, who is really, really unwell and has lost her voice. This is the next session in the Just Transition series that Capire has been hosting this week. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the many lands from which we are meeting on, and in the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this call today. I'm at home in beautiful Kaurna country in Adelaide, and we have panellists calling in from all around Australia. And I know we've got people registered from all over Australia. So if you know the land that you're calling in from, please take a moment and pop that into the Zoom chat. It's always a nice way to start the session by connecting with one another and taking a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on. In terms of housekeeping, please feel free to jump in and use the Q&A function for questions and also to share any reflections. We have Hannah Bishop here from Capire, who's providing the technical support at the back. And this session is going to be recorded, and the views of those panellists who are joining us are their own views, not necessarily their organisations. And we're here for 1 hour, and as a facilitator, I hope to keep us on time and facilitate the conversation with our panellists. And as mentioned, we really encourage you to pop questions that you're thinking of into the chat, and we will try and weave them in. Thank you. Capire is one of Australia's largest specialist community engagement consultancies, and we have been delivering quite a lot of renewable engagement work in the energy sector, and we've been really seeing the opportunities and the complexities firsthand in our work. And I've worked as an engagement professional for 2 decades and done lots of work in the energy space. So for me, I'm really interested to hear the conversation that we're going to have today with our panellists as well. Through this national webinar series, the Just Transition series, we're really hoping to create a space and a forum where we can share insights and learn from one another and strengthen our best practice engagement through creating this forum this week. And I'm hosting the 5th session. It's called Powering the Land, and we're discussing agriculture and energy. And we've already held 4 sessions which have touched on national leadership and collaboration in the energy transition, the role of local government, practical lessons from renewable energy community benefit models, and Indigenous leadership and partnership in the transition. And later this afternoon at 2 o'clock, Victorian time, we'll be hosting an interactive workshop where Amy Hubbard, who is the founder of Capire, will work with participants to develop their own practical plan for engaging with their communities on their projects. You can still register for that one if you're interested. So I'd like to now go to introductions, and as I say, please have your questions ready. And this session is about how we work with landowners better, earlier and more respectfully, so regional Australia shares in the benefits of the energy transition. Across the plenary session and the other sessions, we've been exploring what a just transition really means, who's impacted, who benefits, how does that look fair on the ground. This is a really significant, wide, deep transformation that's happening in Australia, and it's important that it's done with communities, not to them. So today's session really builds on that, focusing specifically on how renewable energy and agriculture intersect and how engagement can either strengthen or undermine that. So let's get going. Firstly, I'd like to introduce our amazing panel. We have Warrick Squire, who is the CEO of Coexistence Queensland, which works to strengthen relationships between landholders, regional communities and major development industries, including renewable energy. Warrick brings deep experience in policy, change leadership, stakeholder engagement, with a strong focus on practical solutions that balance economic opportunity with community confidence. And in recent years, the organisation has expanded its remit and resources to strengthen how renewable energy and agriculture can be planned and delivered in ways that respect landowners' rights and regional aspirations. So Warrick, I'd like to ask you a question, and I'll ask this of each of the panellists. What's one thing we would never know from reading your bio that has shaped how you think about the energy transition and the role in it, and your role in it?
That's a really good question. Look, in 15 plus years working at the coalface between the ag sector and the resources energy sector, I reckon I've seen the good, the really good, the bad, the really bad, and the really, really ugly. And I'm driven to assist and help people get onto the good side of things and make sure that benefits are realised and really productive relationships are core. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning, supporting people through what is, particularly community members and landholders, through what is a difficult change process. And I've seen it destroy people and livelihoods, but I've also seen the prosperity that it can bring when done well. So I guess that's what drives me. And in my role in Coexistence Queensland, I do that on a daily basis.
Fantastic. Amazing. Lucky they've got you out there doing that work. I'd like to introduce another speaker, which is Charlie Prell, a landowner and an advocate. Charlie's a fourth-generation farmer from the Southern Tablelands in New South Wales and a long-standing advocate for equitable renewable energy development. He hosts some wind turbines on his property and has been a leading voice in demonstrating how agriculture and renewable energy can coexist when engagement is respectful and benefits shared. Charlie served as the chair of the Farmers for Climate Action and has spent more than 15 years encouraging fair and equitable sharing of benefits from renewable projects in rural communities. Charlie, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's one thing that we wouldn't know from your bio that's really shaped how you think about the energy transition and your role in it?
I guess I need to update my bio, but my bio doesn't tell you that. Yeah, everybody's guilty of that, I think. My bio doesn't tell everybody that I've actually retired from farming and sold my farm, which had wind turbines on it. The only reason I was able to retire when I did, and I haven't retired from life, I've retired from farming, was the income that we received from the wind turbines on the land, which made us turned our farm from a pretty broken down, ruined capital, degraded capital farm, pretty typical farm, to a farm with a vibrant and positive outlook and financial stability for the future.
Amazing. Yeah. Farming the wind.
Yeah, why not? We'll talk about that more.
I will. Next, I'd like to introduce Shayne Annett, who's the principal at RMCG Consulting Group. Shayne, you bring more than 25 years of experience in land, water and biodiversity management, working at the intersection of science and policy and community. Your work spans natural resource management, strategic policy and stakeholder engagement with a focus on bridging ecological systems, community needs and long-term land stewardship, a perspective that will be really valuable when renewable energy development intersects with farming landscapes and natural resource values. Once again, same question. What wouldn't we know from your bio that shaped what you think about the energy transition and your role?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Well, I live in a rural area of Gippsland and in Victoria, and there's transmission. It's the western part of Gippsland, so there's transmission infrastructure very close by to our north, east and west of us, very short distance away. It's part of our landscape, but of course, like a lot of people, particularly in rural areas, we have unreliable power supply and we have outages on a pretty frequent basis. Most, in the last couple of years, extended for sort of 4, 5, 6 days, which gets pretty bloody inconvenient when you're in an area where just simple things like your house water relies on electricity. So I guess that for this sort of work, it gives me a little sense of the frustration that people can feel if they feel like they're, hosting or are, seeing electricity infrastructure, and yet they have poor access to it. So it's that sort of, in a way, that justice that sort of sits below the surface, but well, not below the surface, that is right there for a lot of people in rural areas.
Yeah, sure. Very interesting. We'll talk more about that as we go forward, I think. So, as I say, we're going to talk about working with landowners better through this energy transition. To all of you on the panel, from your perspective, what is the single biggest opportunity for landowners in the renewable energy transition, and what's the biggest risk when we get engagement wrong? Can I invite you to continue talking, Shayne, if you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that when the thing, and Charlie's already touched on this, from what we see, it's the influence that having a diversified income that is really subject to far fewer of the foibles that agriculture is. It's not subject to well, it is of course subject to markets ultimately, but it's not subject to the weather, currency markets, international markets, even dietary trends and these sorts of things that farmers have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So that having an opportunity to get some quite stable income, I suppose, from the farm is unusual, I guess, in agriculture. People talk about diversification in agriculture a lot. It's rarely this clear that you can get a stable income from this use of your farm.
Would you agree, Charlie?
Yeah, totally agree. I've often spoken about the opportunity that's here being presented not just to individual landholders like myself that benefited from renewables, but to entire regional communities if we get the transition right. It could be like the fabled nearly war boom of the 1950s, 60s, but it could be across regional Australia, and it will last for decades. So we need to understand the enormity of the opportunity that is there, not just for individuals like myself, as I said, for whole community, whole regional communities.
And Warrick, I guess what are the risks when we get engagement wrong, do you think?
Well, just before we go to risk, one of the things I'd like to draw on what Charlie and Shayne were saying around opportunities. One of the things that I've really seen at a landholder level is that income stream being able to be invested into productivity enhancements on farm. We often hear a lot of narrative around the negative impacts of energy development on agriculture, but in many instances, that income stream is actually allowing for enhanced productivity on those places. So that's a story I don't think we tell well, and that goes across the grazing all the way through the irrigated intensive agriculture sector. And look, from a risk perspective, I really don't see that risk playing out from a host landholder perspective. That tends to be where we see the most comfortable landholders. For what we see around the traps is then the neighbouring landholder issues and concerns that occur when engagement is not done well, and then also that broader community benefit and how communities are seeing the genuine flow through of economic opportunities and enhancements to the resilience of the local and regional economies through renewable energy development.
And do you think we're telling the story well enough of the good stories of the community benefits flowing through?
I think we can always do better. It's pretty hard to get cut through, to be frank, with some of those positive case studies. There's a lot of noise out there that tends to dominate the airwaves, whatever form of development you're talking about in rural areas. And it's complex, whether it's carbon, whether it's biodiversity offsets, whether it's resources or energy. You're generally dealing in that same level of it's different, it's new, we're not sure.
Creates fear. I'll stay with you, Warrick, if that's okay, and ask you a couple more questions. From your statewide perspective, where do you see the greatest pressure points between landholders, communities, renewable energy developers, and what is currently working to address them?
Look, I'll probably approach it at a couple of levels. We in Queensland and in our organisation, we talk about shared landscapes. I don't think there's ever been a point in time where our rural landscape is more complex than it is now. When I think about, I'm a recovering town planner by trade, so I apologise for that. But if I think back 30 years ago when I was doing my planning degree, the thought of actually having to do active planning in the rural environment was just not a consideration. And I think we've moved now to a world where we're managing multiple competing land uses, sometimes complementary in the rural landscape, and it's probably not getting the level of attention it deserves in terms of that strategic planning from a land use, infrastructure and community perspective. So I think, if you look at it from a energy, resources, as I said before, carbon, biodiversity offsets, urban, rural and rural residential development. These are all things that are coalescing to put pressure on agricultural land resources. So it's not a simple equation that we're working in terms of an energy agriculture interface.
No.
In terms of in Queensland, I think we've got some clear expectations being set by government and community around particularly community engagement and community benefit. So you've seen some regulatory reform that's been all about enshrining in legislation some guideposts, if you like, around what government expects in terms of community and stakeholder engagement and mechanisms to upfront deal with community benefit. So that's really important. I guess they're some of the pressure points for industry because it's adapting to what is new and higher bar in terms of those regulatory requirements.
Yeah.
But I think if I look at it beyond that, you've got this social license element over which sits above your regulatory requirements, and I think that's where sometimes we need to look beyond that. Well, this is what we have to do, and this is what we should do, and there's a gap between those two things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I guess it's, like you say, new legislation, so they're needing to navigate that. In terms of the community benefit agreement stuff that came in.
Yeah, and I mean, there were many doing it already. So I mean, it was really just ensuring what good practice looks like.
Exactly.
But there's an element of industry that needs to raise the bar, and you're always judged by your lowest performer in industry and the community. That's where the pub test is, and that's where the Bush Telegraph goes.
Absolutely. So my next question is, what principles or standards are most critical to building confidence among landowners, and where do you see gaps in the current practice or regulation?
Look, I have a really simple principle that I lean on in all my relationships and networks, and I think is important from a community engagement interface, and that's respect. Handshake in the bush is as good as a signature on a contract, and I think that's kind of where that recognition of the value set that developers are working within in that community is really important. Really identifying that early, working within that, respecting that, and simple things like taking the time to build relationships, to understand people's businesses and the impacts these developments are going to have on those businesses, and to really value people's time. We're dealing with community members and landholders who already have a more than full-time job in managing their property and all the stresses and anxieties that go with managing an agricultural operation. And we are asking, as developers, as government, for more of their time, expecting them to be experts in negotiating commercial contracts and energy. And whilst we're talking about very, very savvy business people, it is a lot, and I think that respect is often forgotten in the equation. We had a meeting. We went and saw them. We ticked that box. But did you hear them? Did Did you value that input? How did you respond? What was the outcome? Those are the loops that I see not being followed up and not being tied up in many cases.
Yeah. I might just ask either Charlie or Shayne if you've got any additional comments around what Warrick's just discussing there. I think it's very, very true. We've had the meeting, but how did the landowner have more questions? Did they really understand? Do they need more support, Charlie?
I absolutely agree with everything Warrick just said. But to add to that, I think to build that respect, you need trust and you need transparency.
Well, what does that look like? Do you know what I mean? They're words, but what does it mean?
Yeah. Well, trust means being honest with people, being open, which Warrick again talked about, and not just tick a box exercises, real, honest, open transparency, which builds trust, which builds respect. So there's a lot of discussion in the bush about different developers having different business models. There's some people that are just prospectors that are doing the early work to get a project together and on selling that project.
Yep.
That's fine. That's a normal business development practice. But the issue, the difficulty arises for little landholders on the ground who may not be as aware of business practices as most urban people are. That issue for them is huge, because if the developer, even if it's an early stage developer, doesn't tell the landholders what their business plan is and that they're eventually going to either access finance from a multinational bank or company or whatever, and probably transfer some ownership to those people, then all of a sudden the people on the ground are going, what happened there? We didn't even know this.
What did I negotiate? Yeah.
Which is really important, but it's also important for the little people on the ground to understand that the legal documents they sign, even with early stage developers, are reflected in the planning decisions that are made, but also in the business on selling of that business to larger entities. So it's all really important. And I don't think, without being disrespectful, I think a lot of farmers are not really up to speed with a long-term relationship, and we're talking about decades of a relationship, shifting over time, and also how that impacts on any documents they might have signed.
Shayne, can I just check if you had anything you wanted to add before I ask Warrick a different question?
Just throw one in terms of that question of principles and in terms of community engagement. One of the principles we all, I imagine a lot of people on the call here, subscribe to is you go early. Don't go out there with a done deal. And there's a bit of a Goldilocks here. You can actually go too early, because we've seen lots of projects where the consultation starts, the community, gets involved, and then it's unclear of what they're looking at. The project hasn't, either it can't be because of commercial reasons, there are constraints on what information can be shared, or they don't know. And I think that's kind of struck me early on with some of the community engagement things, where it's like, some cases the principle is strong, but there is actually, it's not an absolute. You need to go with sufficient information to be able to have the conversations. And we're seeing some projects at the moment where community is saying, I'm not going to come to another session because you haven't got any more information for me. That's just, that goes back to that respect thing of, this is taking people's time and energy and anxiety and all sorts of things. It's a really, I'm not saying, that just fix it. It's bloody difficult to strike that balance, but be conscious of both ends of that, too early, too late.
Thanks. What I heard there that really resonated was obviously the piece of respect, but also what Charlie was saying about just really trying to be a lot more transparent, and then what Warrick was saying, go back, check. Do they need further clarification? You probably need to have a lot more meetings than you think you do, really, because it takes people time to build the trust and understand what they're stepping into. Warrick, may I ask you another question, which is, Developers that work across Australia need to follow now up to about 60 different policies and legislations. From a policy perspective, what do you think needs to change to ensure that landowners and communities across Australia are really engaged properly and involved in the transition in a way that they can understand?
Good question. It is a complex policy environment. We spend a lot of our time trying to demystify regulatory frameworks for community out there, and there is no doubt that it is overly complex, duplicative. The policy settings are disjointed, and particularly if you're looking at it at a national perspective, they're very different. You've got very different lenses from various governments across the country, state governments and federal. So it's a challenging space for companies to navigate, and a very costly one, no doubt, from an approvals perspective. But I kind of think we've lost the battle in community if we are leaning on policy and regulation as the leverage point for discussions, and not about what we're doing in terms of forming relationships, engaging collectively with communities around their energy future, and ultimately what is their economic future. And I think that's where I see the conversation, and certainly the role we play. We see a lot of conversations at the project level, which is great, but it does tend to burn communities out, and it means that in areas where there's a good resource, you got lots going on in terms of community engagement, and communities disconnect because they're sick of talking to people and feeling over consulted but undervalued, if you know what I mean. And that's kind of that's some of the behavioural insights that we're gleaning in Queensland. And so some of those policy settings are perpetuating that, because they're forcing the proponents essentially into a siloed engagement approach, community benefit agreements for each project, et cetera. There's greater opportunity, I think, from a policy perspective to attack it. And look, this is Queensland perspective, so we don't have reses at this point, at a more regional, sub-regional scale. So we're engaging more efficiently and effectively with communities, providing mechanisms to really genuinely understand what those values are and what their priorities are, and fitting them into individual projects. So that's probably a bit divergent, but that's kind of where that policy conversation takes me. I've got a really fresh perspective in a conversation with a company about a project yesterday, and the conversation really turning to the complexity of dealing with in a region with multiple projects and cumulative impact, and having a look at it from a siloed project perspective, and how you overcome that.
And I agree. Once the cumulative impact then has a big impact on the social aspect and how much people are able to engage. We did get a question in our question box, which I'd like to throw to the panel. It says, a key pain point in our community is the early prospector non-disclosure agreement. One landholder group got together and shopped around for a developer and are now working on a project as a collective. This seems to avoid the loss of trust among the neighbours. Do you see more of that kind of arrangement in the renewable energy industry and farming businesses as it matures in Australia? Anyone, Charlie, or anyone who'd like to respond?
Yeah, you go, Charlie. I've got.
So have I. But I'll keep it very brief. I think somehow we need to work out how we can encourage landowners to be collective. You can't mandate that, but I've seen projects, 10 or 15 years ago, developments that hadn't been built yet, where landholders under the same project didn't even know who the other landholders were, let alone what sort of agreement they were on. And that's part of the transparency I was talking about earlier, that the developers, even early stage developers, which the question was directed at, it's critical that those people are transparent about the project's future and the project's structure. It's also really, really important that all of the landholders under that specific project are receiving the same remuneration base. It might be different for different infrastructure, like substations and things, but it needs to be the same base. I'll leave it at that for the moment, but that goes back to transparency.
Thank you. And Shayne, did you want to add anything?
In checking around with some of my colleagues, the probably the strongest message I got back was the NDAs are just so understand, but God, they're difficult. Once they're in place, it prevents exactly the sort of collaboration that we're saying. Is there are these opportunities out there to sort of shift it from obligation or response to opportunity, and that's that collective. And from I would think, I'm not a proponent or anything, but I would think from the proponent's point of view, that's a much more attractive proposition to be dealing with a group of landholders who've already done the groundwork, done their own thinking about it, putting out their own prospectus to say we're not responding to you. Here's what we'd like to do as a group. You come to us with the best offer, and we negotiate on that basis. It's just such a shift in the tables from it being we're having to sort of on the fly respond and try and gather our thoughts quickly to being, no, we've got an asset here of land and wind resource or solar. We want to, put ourselves in a position to have the proponents come to us. And there's a few examples of that around that we've heard of, but it seems like that's the maturation that we kind of need, that would be really valuable.
Elizabeth in our chat said, how can developers be transparent but also protect that confidentiality? Warrick, did you have anything else to add to that?
Look, have years of experience dealing with transparency of agreements and compensation. And I go back to the divisiveness of it from a community and social fabric perspective. And I've had many robust conversations with developers around my views on non-disclosure agreements and collective engagement for the very early stage. I just have seen too many instances of neighbour disputes fueled by secrecy and veiled negotiations around options agreements. And it's really heartbreaking to see what it can do in a what was a cohesive community, and that's not unique to renewable energy. It's unique to it's anywhere where you've got development happening that may be not transparent in terms of what neighbours are hearing, and lots happens at the pub, and lots of your non-disclosure agreements not really worth that much down there. I'll tell you from my experience.
Right. So I guess in answer to Elizabeth, how can developers be transparent but protect confidentiality? You're saying
one of the points I was going to make there, and these are commercial agreements, right? So I don't think anyone's saying that you should be disclosing, how much you're getting, but it's the principle of you're in dialogue around something, and we'd love you to know about it as my neighbour of 50 years of. As a friend, as a business associate, as a community member. No one's saying, "Oh, I'm getting 50. What are you getting?" There's got to be some
privacy
because it is commercial. It is not built on a compensation regime that's steeped in legislation like it is in some other sectors, like compulsory acquisition or the resources sector.
Charlie, can I come to you with a different question?
Sure.
As a landowner who's engaged directly in energy and climate conversations, what have you learned about integrating renewable energy into a working farm while maintaining productivity and land stewardship? And I guess...
Yeah, well, I spoke about the land stewardship a bit earlier about the benefits. So I'll leave that as said.
Yep.
I was amazed. The wind farm that I used to be part of was built 2018, 2019, 2020, and all regional Australians, I guess, would remember the severity of that really short but very intense drought, especially in New South Wales. And even through that drought, when stock are putting pressure on fences and things like that, and the wind farm was being built, we had issues with the wind farm company about leaving gates open and things, which happens. But it was really easily fixed by putting a sign on the gate, shut the bloody gate, mate. Even if there's a queue of vehicles. So that said, I was amazed also at how little the construction of a $180 million wind farm how little effect it had on my farming operations.
Right.
We were running a working farm, sheep farm, with cattle on it as well, through the construction of this wind farm. And it, you had to go and talk to the construction company, not the developers, but the construction company, to find out what the program was for the next week or month or whatever. And that's a really important point, actually. But we also, once we knew what the plan was, we could adjust stock, so use lambing and things like that. Or if we're coming up to shearing or weaning or whatever it was, we could adjust where the stock were situated on the farm so that it was compatible with whatever was happening with the wind farm. So the good thing was they built these beautiful roads all over the farm, and
to make it easy to get around.
So they didn't want it, but we went along and put laneways along those roads, which because we had rights to use those roads under, with permission from the wind farm company. They didn't mind at all. They didn't mind us putting laneways in, and that made it easier to move stock. And that's a very normal farming practice. And these roads that you could drive a fire truck, for instance, along these roads at 60, 70, 80 kilometres an hour if you needed to. Not that you would in a normal situation. So lots and lots of benefits, very, very few issues, and most of the issues were resolved with good communication.
Excellent. I've got a question here from the audience. Charlie, how did you go with water consumption during the construction phase, during the drought? One of the concerns up here, not sure where that is, but up here is the forecast cumulative water demand for concrete batching for turbine footing. Yeah.
That's really easy to answer in that specific example. The water that's needed for concrete batching needs to be virtually drinking quality. In fact, it does need to be drinking quality. So they're not going to get that out of a farm dam, for instance.
Okay.
There's a different issue with water for dust suppression on the roads and things like that. The farmer has the right, or the landholder has the right to that water in dams on their farms. And if they want to negotiate an agreement for that water to be used with the wind farm company, they negotiate a commercial agreement. We did that. And it wasn't about necessarily money. It was about making sure the dam was full when they left. So they might have had to cut water into the dam to fill it up. Again, it's about transparency and communication. Nobody really minds if a bushfire fighting helicopter comes in and sucks all the water out of the dam to put out a bushfire. But that's totally separate to a construction company coming in and using water without asking on any particular farm. So again, it's about communication. Water consumption in the longer term, wind turbines don't use water.
No.
Coal, gas, everything else does. Fossil fuels do. Nuclear uses a heap of water.
Yeah.
So in the long term, the water demand from any particular region is probably a positive.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments from the panelists?
Just from a water perspective, it is a very topical issue in certain parts of Queensland. Often it relates to the cumulative water use associated with, particularly at that construction phase, so batching, but also camps, dust suppression, particularly where it's a groundwater resource in a highly used groundwater system. And I think again, we talk of transparency because it's really about understanding what the concerns are in that community around water, and how is it that they can be addressed through good science, because science is key here. Understanding what is the impact from a scientific perspective, how can that be managed, and what as a developer, what are my obligations if something does go wrong and resource access needs to be made good. So I think it's a really good example of the type of, I see it as a social license piece. It's not required as part of the legislation or the planning process, but in some communities, it's going to be a really key issue, and there's an opportunity to proactively address that issue in that community with a course of action and monitoring and management. And that's where I think there's a real opportunity to do some of those things that are above compliance but are really important locally.
That's a great point. And anything to add to that, Shayne, from your world? No? Yeah. You often see water being asked about by communities, but answers not given on it because the construction company is not involved yet, so we can't answer that yet. But that feeds to that transparency piece. But what you just spoke about, bringing in the science and things like that, sounds good to me, Warrick. I'm going to put a question together. We had a couple there, Charlie, but I'm going to just weave these together. There's often a perception of trade-offs that agriculture must give way to renewables. In your experience, is that true? And how important is it that landowners are involved in the very early shaping of those decisions?
Are you asking me, Jen?
Yes, Charlie. Yeah.
Again, the communication is critical, and that only happens with respectful, trustful environment. I think I think the trade-off, there is no trade-off, frankly.
Yeah.
As long as the communication and the communication is really, really strong and robust and probably planned, there's no trade-off about farming operations. With wind, I'm talking. With solar, there's different issues with solar, but more about how the solar farm is constructed, not where or when it's constructed. If it's constructed properly, there's lots and lots of examples now of a thing called agri-solar, where not just sheep, but cattle, vegetables, crops even are grown under solar panels. They need to be a certain distance off the ground for that to happen, and with cattle, they need to be more robustly built. There's a really critical financial question, though, that because renewable energy has become so cheap, and the wholesale energy price, believe it or not, is falling dramatically right now. So that is not really reflected yet in retail prices. Hopefully one day it will be if they break up the cartels a bit. But if the wholesale energy price is really low, renewable energy as well as traditional energy generators, traditional being fossil fuel, are under extreme price pressure to maintain a financial operation. I don't see too much government support, frankly, for renewables, but there's over and over again repeated government support, taxpayer-funded government support for fossil fuel projects, energy generators, coal mines, you name it, gas, royalties, etc. There's plenty of media about all that. So I can't see how that's really even a question. As long as that's done properly and it's done with communities, not to them. That's a bit of a saying now, but it's true. Then I can't see any downside to this, and so many upsides that the few problems that we've spoken about and alluded to here are really easily solved with good communication.
And when you were going through your negotiations, did that create any divides between you and the community that you lived in?
Massive divide.
Right. And
I'm not sure, actually, to be correct, I'm not sure it created them. It amplified them.
Yeah.
The outsiders reading the media get the impression that these renewable developers, whether it's wind, solar or transmission lines, are creating division within communities. It's usually more they're amplifying existing fractures or tensions within communities. Real neighbours are not. I mean, everyone's got good and bad neighbours. And jealousy comes into it, which again is reflected by transparency, but also by really, really solid, meaningful, viable benefit sharing, where people, particularly people that live in and around renewable projects, get to share in the potentially massive wealth benefits, income benefits, but they also get to they are obligated to share in the risks that are being taken. I was negotiating contracts in the early part of this century, 24 or 5 years ago, and nobody really knew what we were doing except I got a good lawyer, and we had a contract that reflected the fact that we didn't know what was going to happen in 25 years' time. So we needed a facility in the contract to allow us to bring valid issues to the table. The same with the renewable energy company; they had the opportunity, the facility to do that as well.
Anything you wanted to add, panelists, to that?
Just a couple of quick points. It's an interesting. There's a bit of mythology about rural communities. You know that there's this unity there, but the same as Charlie, they're just normal communities. Neighbours have disputes and things happen, and these become a source. Sometimes a source of some of those disputes. Going back to that question about trade-offs, I guess the thing we have had to say to some of the proponents is be super careful about suggesting what you think the impacts are on landholders. And have even had a few who've had to say, don't try to suggest to these landholders that there's a win-win here for them or something. Let them work that out. Don't say things like, that we know agriculture and these projects are compatible, but that's not the part. That's not the role, I don't think, of the proponent to try and explain that to landholders. That they know that they will figure that out themselves. That becomes a point of you don't know my business. And adding to that is that some of the dangers we've seen is a perception that there's a level of kind of uniformity in the farming community, that one farm is pretty similar to the next, and illustrated beautifully in some of the impact assessment stuff we've done, where the concept of even what's a property is really difficult to define, or a business is really difficult to define in a rural setting. It's not a simple, it appears to be a simple question, and it is not at all simple. So those sorts of concepts are saying you got to go into this understanding this is a complex environment. Every property, every landholder, the circumstances are going to be unique, and you've got to be ready for that. You've got to allow time for that sort of discussion to evolve and accommodate, that variability.
And while I've got you on that, I guess, what do you think are the most common misunderstandings or risks that farmers encounter when they're first sort of approached by a renewable energy company?
Yeah, I'm sure some of the community members would object to me saying this, but they're not powerless in these discussions. They've actually got both. They've got power in a number of dimensions in that, as I said, the proponents need them. That's part of it. But also, the proponents and the government don't want these projects to blow up. There's a level of opportunity there that being cooperative, there's a threshold question here about whether you're willing to contemplate the project, going ahead on your land, or, that's a threshold question. Once you're in that space, you actually do have a bit of probably more influence and more power than some landholders perhaps recognise. I think it is that being able to switch it across to the opportunity and thinking of it as the individual plus the community. A landholder participating in this can have a huge influence over the way that the community benefits pieces are done, because they have so much sort of, they're at the table all the time. Our observation about that at the moment is the community benefits stuff, and we need to look a bit further in other states. It lacks a bit of imagination at the moment. There are opportunities to do a lot more for long-term benefits for communities. As we kind of say a bit unkindly, perhaps, we've got to go past the footy and netball uniform, phase, and get into some proper changes and real long-term benefits that have a sustained impact on those communities. And that's a bit, that opportunity, I think, is sometimes being missed now.
Yeah. I think I did have a question here I was going to ask you. I know there's one in the chat. I'll come to that in a second, but mine was, what should landowners be thinking about early in the process to protect their long-term interests, including land conditions, succession planning, and future land use? But also what you're saying is,
I think, and the succession one is a really important one. Think about this. Succession is difficult enough on farmland and on farming properties. this adds another dimension to it. Getting that front and center right from, you know, early discussions, I think, is really important, because it's a major factor in how these projects, as Charlie said, these are long-term things. You know, this is going to spill over into other generations. So get that in the discussion right at the outset.
Just to link to you, Warrick, for a second about that community benefits point that Shayne was saying, and the lack of imagination. I don't know, Charlie, you might have something on that as well. I just was curious.
Oh, look, I see this as one of those areas where you need to rise above the single project siloed approach and really look at it from a sub-regional and regional perspective. I'm actually working with we are working with a council in Queensland that is taking that approach and looking at establishing like an overarching legacy plan for the Shire that identifies those community infrastructure or community priorities that can feed into a cumulative community benefit fund and channel funds both at a local level, but at some of those regional priorities. So I think that's where the imagination and the innovation comes in. You're always going to struggle around governance. Who owns it? Is it council? Oh, we don't trust council. You know, is it community based? Then now you got quasi councillors. There is no one size fits all. There's no silver bullet there, but we just got to try different things, and we've got to work together in supporting each other to do those things, I think.
Charlie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, two things. Firstly, directly to Warwick's point he just made, there are entities called community foundations, and they are separate to government. They can be overseen by local government, which is a good thing, but not managed by the government. They're actually managed by the community and community elected board. I think they're essential. I think they actually could play a really big part in the conversation about decommissioning bonds and things like that, that those bonds be over time accumulated into a community foundation that is controlled by the community, and the community gets the benefit of the income from that those investments earn over time. But then the sum is there at the end of the lifetime of the project, which potentially 60 years, maybe even longer than that. That fund is there for funding decommissioning in case the developer or the owner walks away. Just to a point Shayne made earlier, I've lost my train of thought. There's a real issue in relation to income from renewable energy on farms, because there's a really strong drive in New South Wales, and I presume it's national, to apply land tax and other tax imposts that agriculture is exempt from, capital gains tax particularly, but a rising spectre of land tax being levied in New South Wales. I don't know why that is happening, and the easy way to alleviate the liability for any individual farmer or community on that is to designate renewable energy income as primary production income. And if you think about it, it actually is primary production income, because we're creating energy from a primary source, the wind and the sun. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Nice. Thanks, Charlie. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to just ask my final question, which is to all of my panelists. Because we're from a community perspective and engagement perspective, we're seeking advice for community engagement professionals like myself. So to each of you, I'd like you to answer this one. What is your best advice for engagement professionals supporting developers, etc., seeking to improve landowner engagement, particularly in communities where there's distrust due to previous poor engagement or poor developer behaviour? Can I ask you all to give me your sort of a takeaway from that, Charlie?
Yeah, very quickly. I think it comes back to trust and transparency again, and respect. I think it's much better. Well, firstly, the hardest customer to win is the one you've already lost. So there's a huge journey for specialist communication people to go in and fix bad communication from the past. Warrick alluded to it earlier. But also, I think it's much, much better to go in too early than too late. The first port of call for most renewable energy developers is to go to the local government and look at their local development plan and find out what the prospects are for any renewable energy development proposal in a specific local government area. As soon as you do that, the whole community knows about it.
Yeah.
So you're better off going in at that point to the community, saying approximately or roughly what your project outline is. And if you don't know the answer to the question, at least say, I don't know, but this is where we want to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'll leave it at that. Let everybody else say that.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next? Warrick?
Yeah, I'm like, I've got to really get out of here. So, look, first impressions matter, and when you're dealing with historic legacy relationships, it's difficult. But I mean, in simple terms, the piece of advice is don't be schedule driven. Take the time, have a local presence, be active in the community. Information sessions, fly in, fly out engagement is, it's not going to cut it in those kind of circumstances, if ever. So just take the time, build the relationships, build the trust, build the respect. Stay away from schedule.
Lovely. Thanks, Warrick. And Shayne?
Yeah, kind of along similar lines. I feel like it's kind of be ruthlessly kind of consistent and reliable about the consultation stuff that you're doing. Don't. I mean, there's a balance there. Don't run sessions when there's nothing to say to people. But it's that sense of if there's a promise to do something, then follow it through. And build the response to these guys keep they come and go and they don't bloody turn up when they say they're going to. Just get that foundation right and then stay the course. Be, kind of ruthlessly consistent with it, to kind of be able to deflect some of those things that are so easy to, such an easy way to lose respect and lose that contact.
Thank you. Thanks, Shayne. Thanks so much, Warrick, for being with us. Warrick's got to go. I'd like to thank Charlie and Shayne and everybody that's been on the call. I hope you found today interesting. I know I have. And I invite anyone who's interested to come to the final session this afternoon at 2:00. Thanks so much, Shayne. Appreciate it. Lovely.
Thanks.
And thanks, Charlie. And thanks, Hannah. Thank you, everybody who took the time to come on to the call with us. Goodbye.
Pleasure, Jen. Thanks for organising.
Thanks so much. No problem. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.